we're kind of going to go over the concept of culture as Guest goes over it in his book, and as we looked at it from the discussion board, sort of what has happened over the past 150 years with the idea of culture. So we'll do kind of the textbook overview. And then the second part, I'm going to tackle the material again, but I want to do it in a sort of, why does this matter? Why should we care point of view? So basically part one is going to be hopefully pretty straight up. What is culture? What's happening? And then part two will be going back over it with kind of, why should it matter? Or why should we care? So as I kind of think about this, we're in a cultural anthropology class, and this is Kenneth Guest's book, and he's jumping in to tell us what culture is. And, I sort of put it that way because, lots of people over the past 150 years, especially in anthropology, have tried to write the what is culture chapter or the what is culture article, or to try to explain culture. So this is, the 10,000th time that somebody has attempted to do this. And here's Kenneth Guest in 2020 trying to do it. It's his third edition, so he's already tried it a couple times in his earlier textbooks. I look back to the second edition, and his definition hasn't changed from 2018. I didn't go back to the first edition, but I assume it's pretty much the same. In part because when we compare these two definitions, and these are both in your textbooks, you don't have to write them down, but when we compare what E.B. Tylor was saying back in 1871 with what Guest is saying in 2000 something, it's how to say, the definitions are not that different if you kind of look at them. In fact, they sort of at the very beginning of the definitions, they seem to be pretty much exactly the same: a system, a complex whole, knowledge, belief. Then, Tylor lists out some things, but it's not that much different in terms of the language. A number of you noted that there are a couple perhaps differences here. One of them is the idea that culture is contested. That is probably not something that Tylor would have thought about. That culture, he would probably be more in the realm of culture is shared, but he wouldn't have thought about it as being contested. And to be clear, probably that's something that only anthropologists started thinking about in the last 20 or 30 years. There was a long period of emphasis on culture as being shared, and so the contested part is perhaps the newest part. A number of you also noted that, there's a kind of a difference here between, habits acquired by man as a member of society, and of course we'll give Tylor his, he probably meant more like humans, that we would say, and then Guest's emphasis on a group of people. And I think that's perhaps changed a little bit. I'm not sure if I would make as much of it as some of you made. I think by member of society, probably Tylor also meant kind of like group of people. But it may be true that, in the last bit, we've been more interested in understanding the group nature, or instead of thinking about society per se, what kind of groupings are within what we might call a culture. So, this, some of you said, well, things have changed a lot over the last 150 years. Some of you said, well, this is pretty much the same. I mean, my feeling is that, this definition is fairly, they're both fairly similar, and they're both what we might think of as kind of these laundry list definitions. They include huge amounts of stuff, almost everything, you might say. Guest's language is a little bit more active, but to be honest, neither of them are very inspiring as definitions, and we don't necessarily need to have an inspiring definition of culture, but it's not necessarily clear what this is supposed to do for us, or how this is supposed to change things. And so as we'll be talking about, what has changed over the last 150 years is not necessarily so much the definition of culture. within anthropology. What has changed, though, is that outside of anthropology, when Tylor was writing, or when Boas was writing, or when Ruth Benedict or Margaret Mead were writing, very few people used the word culture in the way that anthropologists were starting to use the word. Whereas what's changed now is that you've all heard of the word culture. You all have an idea about it. We use it a lot in terms that are not dissimilar to the way anthropologists might use it. So, you know, certainly a lot has changed, but if we look at these two definitions, they're not, I think that they're not that dissimilar. So, Guest goes into some basics that we think of in anthropology that are probably true, included in all introductory textbook definitions of culture. That culture is learned and taught. So, you know, this is crucial because culture is not something that we are born with. It is not inherent in our genetics or in our biology. And Guest will talk about that more in the next part of the chapter. But culture is something we learn in the sense that we take it on board as members of society, from our parents, from our peers. We learn most of it outside of a school setting. By the time we get to school, we already have most of our, what we might consider our cultural learning. We try to shape people once they're in school, but most of what you know as culture is already done way before school ever starts. And it's certainly not going to change very much because of a few Zoom classes. So culture is learned in the wider sense of being learned as members of society. Guest also notes that culture is symbolic and material. And this is important because some people want to limit culture to the kind of just the thought realm, what people think or what people believe. And some people also would want to limit culture to the material realm. So the Guest mentions like clothing or artistic works. And, you know, we want to be clear that it is both symbolic and material. Then he goes through a number of areas that I would just sort of put under the heading that culture is patterned. And so he talks about norms, how culture helps us with our ideas about, you know, what should be in society, our values, which to me are, you know, pretty similar to the norms. They're different patterns for how we look at the world, that we as humans are overbuilt for being symbolic creatures, for assigning meaning to various objects. It's very difficult for us to think about things without thinking about different symbolic meanings of them. So for human beings, you know, a piece of something that is in a flag, for example, is not just a piece of cloth, but it represents, you know, a country or a group or a statement. And then there's a very interesting section that, you know, I'd encourage you to read on mental maps, where he talks about how, you know, culture provides us with this way of classifying the world. And once we can classify the world in a certain way, it helps us sort things out into categories, which may not have much to do with the natural world, in fact, but once we start thinking about the world with these categorization, we start sorting people or things into these categories. And this will be important when we talk later about ideas about biological race and how people have categorized the world and start to see this thing as existing when, in fact, you know, there may be very little physical differences that people base these classifications on. But the whole idea of a mental map or a schema for organizing the world is a really interesting part of culture. And, you know, I mean, as part of this idea that culture is patterned. Now, I want to go back here to what Guest talks about as shared yet contested. So as we talked about, this is probably one of the big differences between Tylor's definition and Guest's definition, is that culture is shared. It is shared across a group, but it is also something that people talk about, that they debate. Guest here says that culture is constantly changing. So that is not something that perhaps Tylor would have emphasized. Culture is constantly changing, and in some ways, what culture does for us is it helps provide us a template for what we think is meaningful, but it provides us the template for things that we agree to disagree upon, or that we agree to fight over. And culture also provides us a kind of outline for how we do those debates. So what comes up for debate, how it is contested, and how those contests should be resolved are all part of, in fact, our cultural heritage. One example of that might be the practice of veiling or head covering. You know, people get really intensely upset about these kinds of things. But if we look at, say, the three major religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, all to which have various degrees have involved head coverings and scarves and prayer cloths, in some ways, all three of these religions are agreeing that these ideas about who should be veiled and when and where and how much are hugely important things that they're going to, in some cases, fight over. So, you know, culture is something that often points us to the things that we disagree on as much as it points to where we agree. And those contests are going to play out over time. They're going to break down around lines of, you know, depending on our society, around lines of gender, age, race, class, things that we'll talk about in the next part of the course. In anthropology, Guest goes into a little bit of the history of the term culture. So when Tylor was writing back in 1871, the predominant view was this idea of unilineal evolutionism. The idea that all societies could be ranked on a scale from sort of worst or most primitive, savage, backward, up through the civilized, the most developed. The idea that there was a kind of ladder of societies. We see that idea emerging when we read, for example, the Nasi Rema, the Naki Rema, I should pronounce it as, that, you know, the idea that there are people that are primitive or backwards as compared to our own civilized state. And the idea of unilineal evolutionism was that everyone was kind of going along the same path or the ladder toward a predetermined outcome, which was a more civilized state, or that people could become more civilized over time. The importance of Franz Boas in the United States was that he rejected the idea of unilineal evolutionism, and he came up with the idea of what he called, or was ascribed to him, historical particularism, which was kind of the academic basis for anthropology in the United States. There had been other anthropologists before Boas in the United States who were unilineal evolutionists, and Boas rejected that. And so he instead substituted what we know today as more probably we'd think of as cultural relativism, or the idea that every culture needs to be judged by its own standards or makes sense from within. And so that not everyone is on the same pathway or on the same highway or the same road to development, that each society has developed on its own in its own place, and we need to understand and appreciate that. That also happened to a similar degree in the United Kingdom and the UK with the idea of structural functionalism. And I don't want to get too into this, you know, this historical account, but structural functionalism basically proposes that you could look at society, and many anthropologists in the UK called themselves social anthropologists for this very reason, that you could look at society and you could say, well, you know, the kinship in this society has this certain pattern and this certain function, and it has a role to play in this society. And so you could kind of isolate the parts of an interlocked society, and they would all work together to serve a function. Now, again, in some ways, this is a rejection of the unilineal evolutionism, because it forces us to consider each society on its own terms, and it's actually not very evolutionists at all. In this system, societies are kind of working mechanisms. They don't really change that much over time, because each society has its structure and the things that are in it function to a certain way. So the important thing about this is not necessarily to learn these terms and to debate these old authors, but to realize that in both cases, there was a rejection of this hierarchical model of culture that was before with Boas. I mean, before with Tylor and others. At the same time that anthropologists rejected the idea of unilineal evolutionism and instead proposed the idea of culture, the idea of cultural relativism, the idea of structural functionalism, it led to some debates early on in anthropology, which really never got resolved. They were intractable, or they were things that people just sort of kept going around and around about. One of the debates, and there's a great picture of Ruth Benedict in there. She wrote a book called Patterns of Culture, which was a best-selling book in the United States and around the world. And in some ways, it was what was said to translate Franz Boas's ideas to a wider audience. Boas was not the best author. And Ruth Benedict started out as a poet, as a writer, and in some ways Boas recruited her to sort of give his ideas and her own ideas a wider platform. And so this book, Patterns of Culture, was a huge bestseller. I've actually used it in cultural anthropology classes just to talk about the ways in which people saw the world and how Benedict's book really influenced changing those ideas. But one of the debates that Benedict runs into in this book is if culture is talking about a whole or a group and it describes the norm or pattern of an entire society, how then do we account for individual differences? How do people take on board all of this cultural knowledge? Why do some people seem to be misfits in their own culture? How does that even happen if culture is such a complete, all-encompassing whole? What then accounts for individual particularities in this setting? And that was, something that was really, people tried to answer that in various ways, but it was never quite resolved. Another challenge, and this comes up in the UK with structural functionalism, but it could also come up in US anthropology, is if life is structured in such a way that all these things are functioning, then how do societies change? Why would they change? If society is functioning in such a way that things are working well and structuring, then how do people change? How do you account for just life itself? How do you account for conflict or contestations? This was very unclear how do you get from one structure to another. Was again a debate that never really got resolved within the idea of structural functionalism. Another huge issue, as soon as the idea of culture was introduced, was, well, where does one culture begin and another culture end? And if we think of the world as we saw in the first chapter, as humans are always interconnected, then they're always talking to each other, sharing, trading things around. How can we say where one culture, and some people would mark themselves off as a group, but for other people, they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be bounded in the same way that an anthropologist might think. And what happens to people who move from one group to another? And again, how do you account for a society in which individuals or whole groups might have a lot of difference within them? There were various ideas about this problem. Some people proposed the idea of subcultures, which are related to a larger culture. Culture in general started to get kind of smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point that now, today, sometimes you'll hear about, the Hartwick College culture, or the culture of students, the culture of you. So it's kind of, in general, I think there's been this idea of, well, we can only describe a very small element as a culture. But this is was a huge debate, or I mean, it was something that in some ways was never resolved, is how do you know where one culture stops and the other one begins? Now, when we go into Wednesday's class, we're going to read the second part of the chapter, which is what I call culture refined. So we're going to be talking about things like power, but we're not just power, we're going to be talking about hegemony and structure and agency and all kinds of big words and big ideas and ever more sophisticated attempts to answer some of these debates. So in anthropology, since say the 1960s or 1970s, and in part in response to some of these intractable debates, the concept or the idea of anthropology gets more and more sophisticated, or more and more, in other words, hard to understand. The ideas get bigger, the books get longer, the complexity of understanding these things seems to get more and more difficult to comprehend. So as you go along in anthropology, and I think it will, I don't want to scare you off too much from the second part of this chapter, there's a lot of cool stuff in it, but at the same time, I mean, it shows you how much since in the last 30, 40, or 50 years, the idea of culture has become something that people have all these new words to talk about it, and especially the idea of how culture is connected to power, which is something that Guest will be talking about throughout. All right, I'm gonna pause there for a second and see what's going on in the chat, or if you want to unmute your mic. This is actually the end of our part one, where we've taken ourselves through the textbook up until now. So any questions about what we've talked about so far, or any comments? All right, fun times. So part two. So in part two, I'm going to start with kind of a provocative question, or I hope it's provocative, which is, we're going to go back over this material and we're going to wonder here, after 150 years of living with this idea of culture, if culture should still be part of our anthropological toolkit. Should it actually be something that we're concerned with teaching and learning among anthropologists and among the students? And you might be thinking, wait a second, what are you talking about? We're in a cultural anthropology class and you're going to tell me that culture might not be a useful thing to learn about? So yes, I'm going to be slightly provocative here. To put it differently, or to put it another way, does it help us? Just think about this for a second. If somebody is doing something that you don't necessarily approve of, or you might find a little bit weird, if you say, well, that's their culture, does that actually help people to better understand one another? And this is something that you remember back in when Guest was defining anthropology, back on page 8, he said it was the study of human diversity, but it was also helping people to better understand one another, to communicate and cooperate and do all those things that you said we needed to do to solve the problems or the issues that are confronting the humanity in the future. So put differently, does it help us to say, okay, well, that's their culture, so I'm just going to go with it? Or alternatively, does that just make you angrier and you're like, well, that's not a good thing to do? So that's kind of the preface for what we're going to be talking about, is what is the usefulness of the idea or the concept of culture after 150 years that we've been living with it. So a little bit of a tiny change in the PowerPoint. We're going to do some pink here, and then the other slides will come back into view as we sort of go over this material again. So, as I said at the beginning, when we compare these two definitions, neither of them are very inspiring or exciting. Now, you don't necessarily need to have an inspiring or exciting definition of culture. After all, this is an academic study. This is an academic class. No one is expecting massively entertaining things to happen. But I think that in some ways, what Guest does not help us understand is that, in fact, when this definition, not necessarily Tylor's definition, but perhaps how Boas used it, was getting out there in the world, it was seen as exciting and a very different or even revolutionary way to look at the world. And so what Boas and Benedict and Margaret Mead did is they took this laundry list, right? They took this thing that was kind of, okay, culture is everything, it's all these things, and they made it do something. They said, well, not only is this all these things, but this is the way we become human, and it's what explains why humans are different from each other. So the who cares part of this was humongously important at the time, and it's probably humongously important now, because what culture was deployed against was the racial or biological determinism of the time. And some of you got at this in your comments on the discussion, that you kind of recognize that, hey, culture is against the idea that these things that are human difference is somehow set by our race or by our biology. And so what anthropologists were saying, which was revolutionary at the time, is that your capacities, your human capacities, your humanness was not determined by your race or by your genes or by your biology, but by this other stuff that we were going to call culture. So this was, again, fairly revolutionary at the time. It was also deployed against the idea of ethnocentrism, or that our own society was the divine standard, or the most advanced, or the only way to be human, or the only way to be civilized in the world, was the one that the Europeans and the North Americans had invented. And so, like Miner's article, culture was deployed against these ideas of hierarchical ethnocentric categorizations of other people. We can see this. So there's a couple, just going to give you a couple book covers. There's a book that came out, it came out last year, I think, maybe 2 years ago, by Charles King. He's not an anthropologist, but he sort of glimpsed the importance of anthropology. It's called Gods of the Upper Air. And then I don't know if you can read that subtitle, but it's important. It says, How a Circle of Renegade Anthropologists Reinvented Race, Sex, and Gender in the 20th Century. So this is about Boas, it's about Margaret Mead, it's about Ruth Benedict. It's also importantly about Zora Neale Hurston, who was part of this circle, but also went her own way. And I contemplated assigning this book for the class. I may assign it to my spring class on anthropology at work, just because it's kind of the way people are rethinking the history of anthropology. And so what King is saying here is that, hey, at the time, people thought of, race, sex, and gender as biologically given, and the circle of renegade anthropologists really helped us think differently about that. And then there's also this book that's a kind of a title of essays, Margaret Mead Made Me Gay. Now, that's not actually true. No one actually believes that. Don't take that too literally. But the idea is that Margaret Mead, in fighting against the idea of gender and sex as being biologically determined, helped people to understand that there were different social possibilities for gender roles, for ideas about sex and when and where and with whom you should have it. And so, Again, don't take this too literally. It's just the title of a collection of essays. But there was this kind of, I mean, there was a time in which Margaret Mead was a household name in the United States. And she was very controversial, and she was seen as offering us a whole different possibility of how to organize our society. So, this was sort of exciting stuff at the time for these, the idea of renegade anthropologists. Now, what happened to this? In some ways, the idea of culture became quite accepted in US society. It wasn't, I mean, there's still lots of racism, and there's still lots of people who don't believe that your society can be learned and changed. But in general, people sort of took this idea on board. However, they took it on board in a funny way. When people talked about culture, it kind of became like they used to talk about race, or what some people have called race light. So, it was like, well, we used to say this, but now we're saying that. And so it became kind of a swapping of words and ideas, a euphemism, a more polite way of speaking about things than people might have had in the past. So you would say, well, the Muslims, they aren't savages, but that's just, it's Muslim culture which makes them, do the things they do. Or you might say, well, blacks aren't naturally poor. They're not biologically that way, but African American culture, the culture of poverty is actually an idea that some anthropologists talked about. So it's a cultural thing, but it wouldn't necessarily be that different. Or you might say, well, it's not true that Mexicans are naturally hardworking, but it's, Mexican culture to work hard and do those. So it could have, it can have these positive attributes or negative attributes, but it doesn't necessarily change how people were thinking about the world. It just kind of made it a little bit more polite. So that's what happened in the popular sphere. In the universities, in the colleges, in academia, culture gave anthropologists something to teach, something to study. And so if anybody said, well, what are you doing over there? We'd say, hey, we study culture. That's what we do. And so, you can see that this is a little bit different than being a renegade anthropologist. The renegade anthropologists were out there, there wasn't an academic sphere to be in. But the new anthropologists, the people who got trained, they needed to teach, they needed jobs. It's very, very, very ill paid to be a renegade anthropologist. There can only be a few of them. But if you want to be an academic discipline, you need to have, more respectability, and culture gives you that. And I said, well, we're the ones, if political scientists study politics and economists study the economy, we study culture. And I think that in some ways it also became, well, we don't just, we study other cultures. So we gave, sociologists study Europe and American societies, but we're going to go out and study those people who are out there, the other cultures. And so, for Ruth Benedict, for Franz Boas, for Margaret Mead, most of these early case studies in anthropology were of peoples who were outside of the West, were relatively isolated. And we talked about this in the first classes last week, as this became kind of the stereotype of anthropology, that we studied, people who were outside of the mainstream. And there were very good reasons to do that. There was a lot of ethnocentrism toward those groups, but it led to a kind of slot for anthropology that we studied all these, strange people. And so in the process of this, if you remember, what was exciting about culture when Boas and Benedict and Mead were deploying it was that it was against they were renegades. They were deploying it against some of the prevalent ideas at the time. Whereas as things went on, it became much less of we're fighting against those ideas, and much more of something something that you studied that was out there. And it became difficult to, that was part of the problem. That's why we got into so many intractable debates, because everybody's like, well, where is this thing you call culture, and who has it, and where does it come from, and how does it do this and that? Because once you start talking about it as, in some ways, the idea that everyone becomes human in a particular way, that's a sort of big idea. But once you start trying to define, well, here's this group or that group, then you're talking about something that's very different, much more noun-like, rather than the process of culture, which is what we had hoped to be talking about at the beginning. So when we think about what happened in the world, is that there was a divergence between what was happening in the academic sphere and the popular sphere. So as we'll talk about on Wednesday with these big words and things like hegemony and power, structure, and agency, in academia, things got much more sophisticated, harder to understand, whereas in the popular sphere, people were talking about culture all the time. So again, they would talk about, well, in the culture of, the Mexican culture, we'll go back to, that's why they're so hardworking. It's part of their culture. They grow up that way. And so that was said, that becomes kind of a catch-all for explaining how things are in the world. And when that happens, people used culture to basically stop talking about power relationships or inequality or some sort of historical interconnection between people. So if you say, well, Mexicans are hardworking because of their culture, it doesn't tell you about how, Mexicans were incorporated and inserted into the US society as, kind of the manual laborers and farm hands. And that was something that people were, that was the only thing that they were allowed to do. So people would use culture. Well, let's take another example. If you say, well, Blacks aren't naturally poor, it's the culture. If you explain it by culture, then you're overlooking sort of the historical inequalities and interconnections of society, and you don't have to be uncomfortable, because in fact you can say, well, that's just their culture, and that's, everybody has their own culture, so we don't need to worry about how there is inequality both within and between other cultures. And so that's what we talked about, is the Naki Rema still a useful article to read? Because in fact, the Naki Rema tells us about ethnocentrism, but it doesn't say anything about historical connections between the Naki Rema society and the Native Americans. It doesn't say anything about the way in which there was a power relationship between and within American society, and it doesn't have much historical material at all. So culture became a way in which people outside of anthropology were able to avoid issues that anthropologists were trying to talk about, but because there was this divergence between what was happening in the universities and in sort of anthropological textbooks, and especially in anthropological research, it was difficult to bridge this gap. And so anthropologists became sort of, over time, over the last 20 years, I think anthropologists have become increasingly alarmed at the way people use culture in order to not talk about power. And Guest in this textbook tries to link culture always to power. That will be a theme throughout the textbook and in each chapter. But in some ways, we might say that battle is difficult to get back, or we may have already lost that fight because people use culture in this way. So, going back to the question of part 2, should culture still be part of our anthropological toolkit? I, along with Guest, and I think many anthropologists would say, yeah, I mean, it's still very important to understand the idea, the concept of culture, the idea of being, of learned behavior, of shared yet contested, of the, you know, the way in which culture helps us with their, I mean, helps, creates our mental maps, our norms and values. All of those things are very important to understand, especially as compared to some of the still trending ideas of biological and racial determinism. Sure, we need the idea or concept of culture. But when you think about how people use culture outside, the word is used all the time, and it is often sort of problematic. It's often used in a problematic way. Or in other words, it may not help people better understand one another. If someone is doing something that you consider to be weird or terrible, and you say, well, that's just their culture, somebody else, I think, is likely to say, well, that culture sucks, man. I don't like that culture at all. And so it doesn't really matter if you've used kind of a, you know, the old-fashioned, we might call racial ideas, or the new-fashioned cultural ideas, unless you're helping people to explain what's going on, you're not necessarily helping people better understand one another simply by deploying or throwing out the term culture. And I want to, in the next class, I think I've warned you about this in an email, but I want to delve into something that the Guest starts off the chapter with and then ends the chapter with in the Thinking Like an Anthropologist. So, you know, the question is, when we think about American gun culture, that's what Guest describes what we're going to be looking at a little bit. Does it help us to understand, analyze, if we were interested in stemming gun violence, would the term American gun culture help us do that? Does it help in our analysis of what's going on, or is it one of those places that the word becomes problematic and overused? So that's going to be, I'll leave that open for a discussion point on Wednesday. I mean, something that is very interesting to me. I've been kind of at various times